I want to talk a little bit about how you're probably giving up on yourself. Now, I know that may sound a little bit uncomfortable to hear, but the truth is that many of us are making decisions by not making any, and we're ultimately giving up on ourselves and giving up on what we want for our lives. So I wanted to take just a few minutes here to share with you how this is happening and what you can actually do about it. So it all starts out with the things that we do every single day. You know, things like complaining about clients, complaining about our jobs, being frustrated with our work situations, buying into the story that we're victims because of the amount of student loan debt we have. That's another thing that a lot of us do pretty commonly. And even just engaging in the workplace drama. You know, all that nitpicking stuff that happens behind the scenes, the talking about each other, stabbing each other in the back, some things like that that you see across different veterinary facilities. All of those types of things actually are not helping you at all. And they actually are contributing to you giving up on yourself. The reason is because what you don't realize is that all of these actions, which all feel super justified, right? So a lot of times a client does something that's frustrating, maybe a coworker does something that's frustrating, you get out of work late, you don't like your pay, like all these things, complaining about them and talking about them and commiserating about them all feels very justified. But what we don't realize is the impact that it's actually having on the rest of our life. What's happening is that those types of actions and activities, they feed things like dread, you know, dreading going into work the next day. They also feed things like this belief that going into vet med at all was the absolute worst decision ever. I know a lot of you, as you've been in the veterinary profession for any period of time and you've experienced these kinds of frustrations, you come to these conclusions that this decision to go into vet med was wrong, that you're just not cut out for this, and this was the worst thing that you ever did. You've ruined your life by making that choice. Along with that, another thing that this fuels is just fear that you're never going to have the life that you want. And from there, it all becomes very dark, doesn't it? We just don't realize, though, how much of an influence that the actions that we take and the things that we do continue to fuel these beliefs of misery, like this reality of misery that we're creating. And it feels really awful, though. We do know that. We do know that between the stress of the job and then the way that that is impacting the rest of our lives, we do know that we feel terrible. It feels really miserable. And so a lot of us turn to other things to try to feel better. Things like eating. Like for me, you guys know, if you've been hanging out with me any period of time, I was all about Starbucks and ice cream, and it definitely played a toll on me the longer that I was in practice. So a lot of us do things like we overeat, we overdrink, we turn to drugs. Many of us shop, like we're Amazon shoppers. We feel better by going in and purchasing things, or just scrolling on social media, like sitting in the evening at home, scrolling through on our phones. Those are the things that we do to cope. And we don't necessarily even realize that they're coping mechanisms. But what we're doing is we're just trying to make ourselves feel better. Because without those distractions, we're left thinking about all those things that frustrate us and thinking about the cases that we don't know how they're going to turn out, or the ones that went south, or the clients that got angry, or the low amount of money in our bank account and the student loan debt that is climbing despite our payments. So we're left with all of those kinds of sentences bouncing around inside of our minds. And all of those sentences make us feel really awful. When we think about those things, we feel really awful. So it makes sense that we would turn to something external to try to feel better, to try to distract ourselves away from that. The bummer of it is that even though we feel better for a little bit of time when we do those things, there are consequences to those things as well. So consequences like maybe like weight gain, or being foggy, like brain fog. Also just like losing time. So many of us are super, like, what's the word I'm looking for here? Like, we're very aware of how much we overwork. Like, we're very protective of our time. Like, we feel very victimized by our jobs because it does take so much of our time. But then we go home and we do things like scrolling on Facebook or shopping on social media or doing all that, and we lose even more time. It's very interesting how the little bit of time we have, we actually end up not spending it on things that we want to do because we're trying to cover up the crummy feelings we have from the work that we've been doing and the environment that we've left when we've left the workplace. The other things that we do, especially when we're trying to cover up some of this with things like shopping, is we actually create less money. So we have money, we're already stressed about money, and then we shop to feel better and we spend money, and then our bank account keeps going down. So we actually, if you can see, what happens is that many of the negative feelings that we have, the misery, if you will, that we have, we actually perpetuate it, and we make it even worse by the things that we do to try to not feel those things. It's very interesting the way that it all kind of circles back around and just creates more if we don't want in our lives. And for many of us, we actually just think that we don't have any control over it at all, like it's never going to get better. But for a lot of us, we start to look for solutions. So what are the solutions? When it all starts with believing that this is the worst job ever, like that the place that you work is not the right place to work, or the career that you chose was not the right career to choose. When we look at it from that perspective and we try to find solutions, then those solutions are things like finding a different job or going to get more education, because if you get more education in a different area, then the job you'll have after that will be better. Or maybe what you're doing is you're thinking of a way to get out of the profession altogether. So you're completely thinking about ditching it completely. And what happens with that is, even though we're looking for solutions, just entertaining those ideas of finding a different position or going for more education or leaving the career altogether, those thoughts, entertaining those ideas of leaving, all of those thoughts actually create a whole other set of emotions. And for a lot of us, the emotions that come up are things like shame and guilt and embarrassment and inadequacy and fear. And all of those come up because our brain is offering us these sentences like, you weren't cut out to do this job. If you were better, then you wouldn't be thinking about leaving it. And just the idea of considering leaving it, like, it's super embarrassing because you're believing that that means that you're a failure. So even then, as you start to look for solutions, you can see how that even compounds the negative. It makes you feel even worse. And it seems like there's like no way out of this trap, right? So if you keep doing what you're doing, going to your job in the veterinary world, engaging in all the normal things that happen day in and day out in the veterinary practice, and that creates negative. And then you go home and you try to feel better by doing any of these other activities like eating and shopping and drinking and all that. Well, then that makes you feel worse. And so then you're looking for a solution. And the solution is like changing jobs, changing careers, getting more education. But then as you consider those, then you start to feel bad about that as well. It just seems like this never-ending downward spiral that you can never get out of. And it's a really miserable place to be. So if you're there, I just want you to know you're not alone. Many, many, many of us end up there. But what I also want you to know is that just continuing to spin in that cycle isn't helping you. That it really is a way that you might be giving up on yourself. It seems like you're trying to help yourself. But if you're not taking any kind of intentional action to understand what's really going on, then what's happening is that you're unintentionally giving up. You're accepting that this is as good as it gets. You're beating yourself up for having chosen this profession, and you don't see that there actually is a way to make it all better. The big piece of this, the piece that we're missing, the piece that they don't teach us, is how the way that we feel doesn't have anything to do with the external circumstances. It doesn't have anything to do with the job and all that. And I know, like, I'm not going to like spend a whole lot of time on the emotions here, but I want you guys to hear me on this, because many of us, when you start talking about emotions, like, let's just not talk about that, right? Like, it's going to get all fluffy and weird. And if we talk about emotions, then it's weak. And who has time for that anyway? Like, I don't know about you, but I'm like a let's get some shit done kind of girl. I'm like, I do not have the time to think about the way that I feel about this. It's irrelevant. There are things to be done. There are patients to serve. There are lives to save. And my emotions don't really play into this. They're not really relevant to how I do my job and I live my life.